All right, welcome back to AI for 2021 Finance Summit, presented by Dot Data. I hope you're having an awesome time so far. Our next session is titled Achieving Responsible AI in Finance with Model Performance Management. Please join me in welcoming our speakers to the virtual stage.
Awesome. Thank you, Patricia. And thanks for everyone joining the summit. Today, we have Sri Krishnamurthy, CEO of QuantUniversity, in discussion with us. So we have an interesting Q&A. Sri, could you just introduce yourself, to the audience, what you do and what QuantUniversity does?
Absolutely. Thanks, Krishna, for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this session. I wish it was in person, but in the virtual stage, I'm so glad to again come back and have a discussion with you. My name is Sri Krishnamurthy. I run a company called QuantUniversity. We are based out of Boston. We focus on the intersection of pragmatic applications of data science, machine learning, and quantitative finance. The last few years, we've been focusing on operationalizing machine learning in the financial services industry and the challenges which go along with that, and responsible AI and adoption of pragmatic ways of bringing in AI and machine learning into the practice is something which is near and dear to my heart. And I look forward to the discussion, Krishna.
Awesome. Thank you, Sri. I'm Krishna Gade. I'm the founder CEO of Fiddler. Kind of for the audience sake, presenting a few slides to kind of talk about the background of the company. Just one moment. So at Fiddler, we work on, model performance management and explainable AI. The problems we are trying to solve at Fiddler are, helping machine learning teams who are putting models into production, deal with model transparency issues, model drift issues, model bias issues, model compliance issues. If you've been following news around, AI operational risk, you may have seen one of these news stories, whether the Apple Card, bias news story, or the coronavirus, causing models to drift news story recently. And this is what we are trying to solve, here at Fiddler. We help teams that are deploying models into production to provide them visibility. So today, as companies are going, putting models into production, they're having these issues with respect to lack of monitoring, lack of, visibility and, explainability of these models. And this is affecting, a variety of stakeholders. And that's causing these, various different operational risks with AI, which we are going to expand on in the discussion with Sri, whether that is model performance degradation or black box nature of the models, or the bias in the models, or the data quality issues. So at Fiddler, what we have brought is a new kind of a solution. We call it an explainable monitoring system. It's a visual analytics tool that helps companies to monitor their models and explain their performance at scale. And it's kind of akin to like some of the tools that have been developed in the past for DevOps teams or product teams. But we are building a new tool for the machine learning engineer or the data scientist, keeping them in mind. So the way we kind of imagining this model performance management is to have something that fits throughout the entire workflow of a data scientist, where you can help them sort of detect bias in their training sets, validate models before they deploy to production, compare challenger and champion models, monitor the performance of the models over time, and then do root cause analysis when things go wrong in production. So therefore completing this feedback loop, we are attempting to help the data science teams to prepare the models in a responsible manner, so that they can deal with like all of the operational risks around AI. The idea is to provide this visual experience, a kind of a cockpit view of all the models and the associated performance data in one snapshot, so that data teams, the business users and the compliance users can all get these insights. So with that, I would jump into the Q&A, and we can get started. So maybe my first question, to Sri, who obviously I've met actually at one of the model risk management conferences, and he's been working in financial industry for a while, is Sri, like the Fed recently had a virtual forum on how to develop, how to help financial institutions build responsible AI, and the main point was around how important it is to open up black box models.
Mhm.
How do you define responsible AI in the context of financial institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Krishna. And for people who haven't had a chance to look at the proceedings of this virtual workshop, I would highly recommend, especially if you're in financial services. Now, going back to my quant days, which was at Citigroup, 15 plus years ago, managing models in the financial industry is not something new. We have been pioneers in building and adopting models in the financial industry for a really long time. In fact, the whole area of model risk management is something we have pioneered, and one of the mature industries in all other industries is the financial industry, wherein model risk management as a function is very well defined. Now, what we are seeing is the methodologies of adopting AI and machine learning is something new, because traditionally we've been building stochastic models, statistical models, wherein the modeling assumptions were you take a whole population and you cannot basically model the whole population. You take a sample and you build a model for the sample and extrapolate those assumptions to the population, right? And at that point, you have to make a lot of modeling assumptions to keep it simplistic, because humans need to grasp for what the models do. Now, with artificial intelligence and machine learning come in, we've seen a lot of progression in terms of the ways in which models themselves are being built, which means that there are two important things we are kind of dealing with. One is the complexity, right? And then secondly, we have to think about how can we understand what the models are actually doing behind the scenes, but also how can we explain to the end users what these models are doing if we are adopting this. So the whole notion of responsible AI is to kind of do the contextualization of what it actually means to adopt a model in production. And secondly, have the diligence framework so that you can understand what's actually happening and have a process-driven approach to make sure that the adoption and the integration of these newer technologies in the enterprise is done in a responsible way.
Yeah. That's a great insight. So you've been working in financial industry, working on quantitative models for a while. And why do you think this whole transparency thing suddenly so important, like the opening of the black box when it comes to machine learning models today? Why is it actually a problem?
That's a great question, right? So in the past, I mean, I've done my tour of duty at companies which build modeling tools at MathWorks. So we had the whole notion of, well, you can see what actually the model does behind the scenes because it's written in MATLAB, right? And then you would kind of decipher, I have the mathematical equation, and this is how I would code it up, and this is how calculators would be built. Now, with the influx of tooling, with AutoML and with deep neural networks, the complexity has significantly grown. And what that means is, you are no longer dealing with the linear assumptions and the simplistic assumptions we were dealing with before. Secondly, the financial data is not like other data sets, right? Wherein it's a physical phenomenon, or you have image data and you have really good ground truth and you model it and you're done with it, kind of a thing. Things keep changing in the financial services industry. And the most important thing is the financial industry has a fiduciary responsibility because they're stewards and they are basically responsible for somebody else's assets most of the times, right? And in that perspective, they are going to be using technology to either augment or enhance their investment processes. They need to really understand, and that's where transparency is kind of coming in, because it's not only about the speed, the agility, and the coolness of the models in various ways. It's more of getting to understand what it actually does before you can adopt it. And the other aspect is most of the financial applications, especially if it's B2C, they have systemic implications, the societal implications. If you're a company which gives millions and millions of credit cards to people, and you've built a model which has either an explicit or an implicit bias in it,
right,
then there are systemic effects on what the population is going to have to deal with. And that's where the financial industry has to really think about, what do we know and how can we make sure that we're putting together the due diligence practice in place before we can take these into the production level capabilities.
right. Awesome. So, at Fiddler, we are also working with a couple of large, US banks and, kind of setting up like this centralized model validation monitoring systems. And one of the things that we are noticing is this shift from this, old school quant models to this, machine learning models, and therefore this emergence of new set of tools to kind of, monitor them and validate them. From your perspective, like where does, like, for example, model validation, for example, let's say from let's say I'm in a model risk management team, I have a bunch of model validation analysts. What are some of the hard challenges to validate a black box machine learning model? Where is the, like, whether that's productivity challenges or lack of toolkit or maybe like lack of skills, where do you see like the spectrum?
Yeah, that's I guess it's a problem which a lot of companies are now dealing with, because we don't have a clear-cut definition of what a model is yet in the context of machine learning models, because the field is evolving so fast. So a lot of companies are maybe using just machine learning as a service.
Right.
They may just not even be thinking about a model. I'm just calling an API and having a natural language processing model do some whatever analysis and get me back the results. So I'm an end user of the model's decisions, right? On the other hand, you may have organizations which are really, really sophisticated. For example, I was doing a workshop a couple of years ago in New York, and we had 15 people from the same company come down, and each one of them had a PhD, right? And they basically were, given this task of taking all their text corpuses and build out models.
Right.
And in that particular case, they had the skills. They were kind of starting from scratch. But I also was dealing with a bank a couple of weeks ago, wherein they said, like, the model risk manager is the model risk director and has one analyst working with her. And she was saying, well, most of the stuff we do is external model validation because we don't have the internal bandwidth. And our quants are just, they don't have the sophistication, but we want to use machine learning for specific reasons. Right. So it depends on the constituencies of who are involved with model risk management. Now, in the context of validating black box models, there is this definitely skill asymmetry, wherein the development teams probably know a lot more. So for them, explainability, kind of means that they really understand the underlying aspects of the model. Model risk management teams have two goals, right? One is the verification piece, wherein they verify that the model is doing what it's supposed to do, which could be technical verification or even kind of looking at the robustness of the process of building and the whole thing. But the validation piece also involves contextualization, which is to make sure that the model is applied in the right scenarios, can handle the challenges which will come with the usage of it. For example, if it's used for a credit rate making decision, and someone gets rejected and they respond back saying, well, explain to me why was my application rejected. Now, can we go to that level of explanation where we can tell people what's actually happening, right? So that's where the model risk management team has a unique challenge, not only understanding the technical piece, but also contextualize it from a business perspective. And that's where black box models are difficult. And that's where the whole notion of interpretability and explainability is kind of becoming extremely important in the financial industry. Because if you don't really understand both underlying aspects of the model, don't really understand how the applicability of the model, then at that point, you're kind of flying in the dark in a bit. So that's where a lot of companies are seeing that as an important puzzle in the productionization of machine learning models.
Yeah. So in simple terms, model validation is basically QA of models, right? It's essentially, there's a second person who's like taking a look at the model and testing its robustness, testing its failure scenarios and trying to understand how it was built so that it can be blessed to launch in production. How would you agree with this type of formulation? How do you kind of think about it?
Well, it depends on the scoping. In some cases that could be the definition, because it's just a gating process for things to move into production. But I've seen the field evolve significantly, and that's because the business mandates are not just easily translatable to technical goals, because the model could be used in multiple scenarios. But the way people are going to be using it, especially in the context of models like these, it's not always like automated. Like, people just don't turn on these machines and say, okay, let the decisions keep happening. There are always human in the loop, right?
Right.
So what can analysts do? What is this fat finger effect, wherein, instead of a 0.1, someone puts in a 0.001, and what will it do? I mean, the model is going to give you the accurate results. If you just look at QA, it's going to work fine.
Right.
But if you use the results, then bad things are going to happen, right?
Right.
So that's where, I have looked at models wherein, there is this whole notion of, what if there's a divide by 0? What if there is a 0.01 instead of a 0.1? Well, right now, the model doesn't check it. It just takes the input as is. Now, what do you do? Like, how do you mitigate? How do you control that thing, right? So that's where you would say, well, how about a checklist approach? Wherein you would say, I've checked this, I've checked this, I've checked this, or there's a pop-up that says, here are the inputs which are going in. Are you okay with it?
Right.
And then the user says, that's probably not a 0.01. It should be a 0.1. And then they'll basically correct it, right? So those aspects are what model validation teams are going to be doing, in addition to just the technical validation piece.
Right.
But in addition to that, I think one of the challenges, we got to deal with is model management teams, are also under pressure because they have to kind of, the developers are already built and like they are the gating process, right? So that's where the field is evolving, because they are kind of demanding a seat at the table and not just relegated to, being the last piece of the puzzle and being always under pressure to say, okay, let's just kind of, get the model passed towards production. Kind of thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, in even in like, I'm coming from the software background, you have like your traditional test and DevOps team that is basically always under pressure because the developers want to ship those features. And then it's kind of, similar thing is happening within models as well. You mentioned a very interesting point when you said that, the inputs to the model could come in because of human errors or garbage. If it's automated, if the model is running in an automated manner, the system could generate bad input data as well. And this kind of gets into the second part of the topic, which is like, having a good model monitoring system in place so that you're catching these things and alerting when these things happen. So how do you see, model monitoring in financial industry, how critical it is for, a bank or a financial institution to have proper model monitoring?
Right. So in the past, when people defined a model, it would just be a piece of code, which basically was taking some inputs and generating some outputs. And that's, even if you look at some of the papers and, regulatory documents too, that's kind of the definition of a model, right? But the definition of model has evolved significantly, because when we look at a model, we look at like 4 elements, right? One is the actual code, the modeling code. The second one is the data which goes into the model, because these models are data driven, right? And then the third thing is the environment in which it's running. It could be on on-prem, it could be on the cloud, it could run using GPUs.
Right.
So all of these have effects. And then the process itself, what aspects of it are done, because in the training you could basically say, I'm going to use these conditions, but then you may tune it. But then in the process, you may say, well, when do I refresh my model? Is it a specific time based? Is it event based when something happens, right? So now you are more or less, it's not model management, it's model life cycle management. Right. There's a whole process involved, and the data scientists typically focus on the modeling piece. But when you think about productionizing it or bringing it into a setting wherein it has to run independent of the coders trying to no pun intended, fiddle around, if you will. Right. So you have to have a robust process. So that's where things like model drift, concept drift, data drift are becoming important terms which everyone has to learn. So I remember 6 years back when I was teaching one of the first machine learning courses at Northeastern. So we had like this pipeline. Most of the things were like, you start with like a CSV file, training, testing, build out like a couple of models, maybe put in together like a parameter grid, and then you have a model, and then you look at the parameters, confusion matrices, deploy, and that was like the last box, right? But when it comes down to production, you have to now think about like, well, what is happening? Are the features really generating the outcomes which are influential? And how are humans interpreting these decisions? So all those require a formal model monitoring process. That's where it's not just kind of getting the model into production. It's about what happens afterwards, because more or less decisions happen after the model is deployed, right? So I think you need to have a really robust process for monitoring and then kind of making sure that the models are always fresh and augmenting your decision-making process. So that's where we're kind of seeing that's an important field. Now, I want to ask you, like, what is your view? Because you're kind of seeing the world from this other perspective, wherein, you're working, you're building all these amazing technologies, but now you have, to look at the world in terms of, you have the startups wanting to, build models and fintechs trying to innovate, but you also have established companies deploying models in production. So how are you kind of working with these companies, and, what's kind of the value proposition you are kind of offering as an organization?
Yeah, so I think you touched on a brilliant point out there, which was basically like managing the life cycle of model throughout the process. And I think when we started Fiddler a few years ago, we started with this sort of explainability technology that we wanted to unlock the black box of the models. And then later on we realized that we want to explain the models, but at which point do we explain it? Should we explain it before the training, before the model is deployed, post-production training, post-production deployment? And so that's when we realized that the actual problem, explainability is important, but what is more important is managing the model throughout the life cycle, where, as you just pointed out, what data was it trained with? Does the data have bias in it? What is the feature importance in it? How was the model validated? Having the metrics that was the model validated, having a consistent set of dashboards that teams can create. And then what was the model compared with when it was launched? Having those reports being available so that, teams can do challenge attempt and testings. And then, monitoring the model throughout the lifetime, for drift, for outliers, for, conditions that you want to alert on, and then finding, helping you analyze those problems within those models. And so this is what we realized is kind of, the missing piece, in the machine learning, kind of toolkit today, something that basically sits at the center of the ML lifecycle and kind of watches through throughout, where what's going on in the lifecycle, and keeps track of all of the kind of the metadata, right? Like the model, the artifact itself, the data that it was trained with, all the metrics of the models, so that any point of time, a data scientist or a risk manager or a compliance officer or a business person can come to this dashboard to actually get their answers. And so that's what we are building today, like this kind of comprehensive, ML model performance, management system. And that's what we are seeing, because we have these, disparate silos of, the data science team takes to build a model and then, ships over to the risk management team, and they validate it, and then they get launched again. And there's probably a separate ML ops team that's kind of monitoring it. But having a consistent set of dashboards so that all of them can engage with is actually something that we can bring multiple parties together and then help them kind of build this quote unquote responsible AI. So that's kind of what we have learned working with the industry in the last few years per se.
Yeah. So from one other, please.
Yeah, so I think when you kind of hear this type of a pitch, right? So how does what do you see? Is this sort of, does this resonate? From what you're seeing, and you obviously have been have a lot more experience in this field, teaching these courses and whatnot.
Yeah, so that's that's an excellent question, because initially I was actually doing a workshop for a client. And we were teaching them explainability, interpretability, aspects of model validation from a machine learning perspective. And the pragmatic thing they brought up was, we're just still scratching the surface on what machine learning can do within the industry, and just trying to understand what machine learning is. And now this additional layer of, we needing to also understand how the model works under the hood, and kind of explaining what the model does, and then being responsible for the behavior of the model, which we didn't build, which just we took from an open source world and building it out. And they said it's a pragmatic challenge. It kind of scares us in some way that we are actually doing something more than what we should be doing.
Right.
And most of the companies gravitate towards auto ML models, thinking someone else is maintaining the model, someone else is maintaining the practice, someone else is doing soup to nuts. Right. So if you talk about explainability, we have it kind of a thing. But I think there is an opportunity to kind of, as the it happened in the model validation practice, right? So you had the external model validators kind of augmenting the internal model validation teams to help out doing interesting things. Right. The same way, the whole notion of auditable AI is going to mature.
Right.
Wherein, the consulting companies like the PwCs of the world, the Deloittes of the world, specialized consulting companies like ours, could potentially help out companies who are in this process of building out the stacks to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes and help them kind of even interpret some of these aspects, right? And also the tooling aspect, which you guys are working on to abstract out some of the complexities and making it accessible. Because if it's not accessible and if you have to go through all the calculations from the ground up yourselves, obviously the barrier is going to prevent you from adoption. So having those tooling would definitely help.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sri, and thank you so much for the session. And really appreciate you joining us on this, and talking about responsible AI.
It's always a pleasure, Krishna. Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to continuing the discussion online.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for such an awesome discussion. That was great with a lot of great insights. We appreciate you sharing with us. All right, for the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. And don't forget along the way to accept your connection request, as well as check out our AI exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.
Bye-bye.